Hey, tonight we're going to step into a world most people only know through movies. A world of quiet tension, false names, and secrets passed in the dark. This is not a story about gadgets, tuxedos, or glamorous escapes. There are no exploding pens, no Aston Martins waiting in the alley. This is the other kind of spy story, the one nobody talks about. The Cold War was a different kind of battlefield, one fought in alleyways, embassies, and coded whispers over cheap coffee. To be a spy back then wasn't about action, it was about patience, silence, endless waiting, pretending every day that you were someone else. It was waking up in a borrowed bed with a name that wasn't yours, hoping your face hadn't appeared on a list somewhere overnight. It was smiling at people who might kill you, trusting no one, recording everything, and worst of all, it was never knowing when the game would end, or if you were even winning. So tonight, close your eyes, slow your breath, and drift quietly into a life lived in shadows. This is what it was really like to be a spy during the Cold War. Being a spy during the Cold War wasn't heroic. It was boring, uncomfortable, and exhausting. You didn't leap between rooftops or deliver witty lines while defusing bombs. Most of your work involved sitting, walking, or waiting. A lot of waiting. You didn't even get a cool name. You were Alex, or John, or whatever name was printed on your latest set of forged papers. You usually lived in some cramped apartment in a city where you didn't belong. Your walls were thin, your mattress was lumpy, and the faucet leaked a slow, steady drip that you couldn't fix because calling a plumber might mean talking too much. Every morning, you got dressed with deliberate mediocrity. Not too clean, not too wrinkled. You had to blend in, which meant being forgettable. You couldn't stand out as rich or poor. Your face needed to disappear in crowds. Breakfast was the same thing every day, something quick, cheap, and untraceable. You didn't go to trendy cafes or meet contacts in candlelit restaurants. You went to the same corner shop and bought the same stale bread, served by the same cashier who didn't know your name, which was perfect. You read the local newspaper, not for news, but to memorize minor details. Train delays, a government minister's visit, anything that might matter later. If you were lucky, your day involved making contact. That usually meant dropping a note in a dead drop, under a loose brick, inside a fake electrical box, or beneath a park bench. You didn't meet face to face unless absolutely necessary, and when you did, you didn't speak like in the movies. There were no dramatic exchanges or clever code phrases, just small talk. Boring, meaningless small talk, so no one would notice you. Carrying a gun? Not likely. Most spies didn't. Guns attracted attention, and your whole job was not attracting attention. If you needed to defend yourself, you ran. Or more often, you just accepted you were screwed and hoped the embassy would deny knowing you. Your actual work was administrative. You spent hours copying information by hand. No photocopiers, no email, no encrypted USB drives. Just pencils and paper, maybe a typewriter if you were lucky and the ribbon wasn't jammed. You memorized routes, surveillance schedules, radio frequencies. You burned notes after reading them. You flushed things down the toilet and hoped they didn't clog. Half your energy went into being paranoid. Was the man outside really just smoking, or had he been there too long? Was the phone clicking because of bad wiring, or was someone listening? You kept your curtains closed. You never sat with your back to a window. You had multiple escape plans and didn't trust any of them. If you had to disappear, you knew which street to take, which bus to catch, and which identity to switch to, all in under 60 seconds. You couldn't have a normal relationship. Every friendship was temporary. You lied constantly, even to people you liked. You rehearsed entire fake backstories and adjusted them depending on who was asking. You knew how to sound just foreign enough, how to fake an accent without overdoing it. You had backup IDs hidden in wall panels, burner phones buried in flower pots, and keys labelled for apartments you didn't actually live in. Sometimes nothing happened for days. No assignments, no drops, no messages, just silence. But that was part of the job too. You stayed alert, stayed boring, stayed invisible. You couldn't relax. Even if no one was watching you, you had to act like they were. That kind of tension doesn't just wear you down, it reshapes how you think. You didn't sleep well. You trained yourself to wake up at small sounds. Your dreams were disjointed and quiet, mostly about running or forgetting something. You rarely drank alcohol, not because of principle, but because you couldn't afford to slip. One bad night could ruin a year's worth of cover. Occasionally, you were called in to gather information directly. That meant sneaking into offices, stealing files, photographing documents with tiny cameras that barely worked, and then retracing your steps so precisely that no one suspected you were ever there. And then, more waiting. You were always waiting, for a signal, for a meeting, for extraction. Or worse, for the knock on the door that meant it was all over. You didn't get a warning. You didn't get to explain. If you were caught, you were disavowed. Your name wasn't in any database. Your handlers vanished. And if you were lucky, you ended up in prison. If not, you disappeared. And that was the job. No awards, no public thanks, no movie deals. You didn't tell your kids. You barely told yourself. You carried secrets for years, and when the Cold War ended, you either stayed silent or drank enough to forget it all. Being a spy during that time wasn't about heroism. It was about routine, fear, and doing a job you couldn't talk about, for people you barely trusted, against enemies who were probably doing the exact same thing on the other side of the street. Food during the Cold War wasn't just fuel, it was leverage, punishment, identity, and sometimes the only thing keeping people going. It wasn't glamorous, creative, or even particularly nourishing. For most people on either side of the Iron Curtain, meals weren't enjoyed. They were survived. Soldiers in the field received rations that could barely be called food. Small metal tins of processed meat, dry biscuits that could chip a tooth, and instant coffee so bitter it felt like drinking regret. These were the daily staples of someone who might be crawling through snow or waiting in a trench with no idea when they'd eat again. Spies fared even worse. Unlike soldiers, they couldn't eat with units or join communal meals. They had to blend in, which meant eating what the locals ate. In East Berlin or Moscow, that meant cold cabbage soup, maybe black bread if the store hadn't run out, and thin slices of meat that tasted like old newspaper. Getting access to food wasn't just a matter of money. You needed to stand in line, sometimes for hours, often without knowing what you were even waiting for. If you were caught with the wrong kind of bread, questions were asked. Why do you have that? Who sold it to you? Who are you really? Food scarcity wasn't just a side effect of politics, it was a strategy. Governments knew that hunger could control people better than ideology. In some Eastern Bloc countries, shortages were orchestrated to keep citizens too tired to protest. In the West, rationing and inflation quietly punished those on the margins. Espionage didn't happen in secret labs. It happened over dinner tables, through whispers in grocery queues, and in dark kitchens lit by a single bulb. It wasn't just about decoding messages. It was about figuring out where the next meal would come from without compromising your cover. The psychological toll of food insecurity was massive. When you don't know what you'll eat tomorrow, it's harder to care about long-term plans, morals, or allegiances. Loyalty fades when hunger sharpens, and for those living in occupied zones or contested cities, food could decide who you trusted. A neighbour who shared a can of beans might be your ally, or they might be baiting you. Accepting food could mean showing vulnerability. Declining it could be seen as suspicious. Even storage was a challenge. Refrigerators were rare, unreliable, or loudly inefficient. Hiding extra food was risky, it drew attention. Some agents stored emergency calories in the linings of coats or inside false-bottom suitcases. Canned goods were prized, not for their taste, but for their silence. They didn't need cooking, didn't smell, and didn't spoil easily. One can of ham could last 3 days if rationed right, longer if you had practiced chewing slowly. Eating out was complicated. In places like Prague or Budapest, restaurants were watched. Ordering the wrong thing at the wrong time could signal that you had access to something locals didn't, which raised questions. Why would a nobody like you have money for steak? Why do you speak the language like someone who learned it from a book? Even your utensils mattered. Fork in the wrong hand? You're foreign. Knife held too high? You've had Western training. A meal wasn't just a necessity, it was a test. Every bite was observed, and then there was alcohol. In some places, it was easier to get vodka than bread. Bars became informal intelligence hubs. People drank not to relax, but to forget that they hadn't eaten much that day. You learned to handle your liquor fast or get burned. Spies who drank too much often talked too much. Spies who drank too little looked suspicious. There was no winning, just managing. Back in safe houses or cramped apartments, mealtime was quiet, careful, and quick. No toasts, no lingering conversation, no second helpings. You didn't cook what smelled, you didn't wash dishes ugly, and you didn't leave wrappers in the trash where someone could find them. Even hunger had to be tidy. The worst part wasn't the taste or the portions, it was the knowledge that if your cover was blown, food would be the last of your problems. But until then, it mattered more than anything. Because if you couldn't eat, you couldn't think. And if you couldn't think, you couldn't survive. So you ate the stale crackers, drank the bitter coffee, and hoped the tin can didn't give you away. The enemy wasn't always across the border. Sometimes they were in the next office, watching you with the same cold suspicion you used on others. During the Cold War, being a spy didn't guarantee safety from your own agency. In fact, the longer you worked, the more likely it was that someone within your own organization would start questioning your loyalty. Not because you slipped up, but because paranoia was policy. The assumption was simple. If you haven't been compromised yet, maybe you're too good at hiding it. Agencies didn't just watch the enemy, they watched their own. Surveillance wasn't reserved for targets, it was internal. Your calls could be monitored, your reports double-checked, your movements quietly tracked. If you left your desk at odd hours, someone noticed. If you changed your routine without reason, it went on a report. Sometimes you'd be followed just to test your awareness. If you noticed, good. If you didn't, it raised flags. It wasn't personal, it was protocol. Colleagues weren't teammates, they were potential liabilities. You might work next to someone for 5 years, know their habits, share smokes outside the building, and still have no idea which side they truly served. Double agents weren't rare, they were expected. Both the CIA and KGB suffered high-profile infiltrations. Careers were destroyed not just by failure, but by whispers of failure. A rumor was often enough, and no one defended you once the wheels turned. Silence was safer than standing up for a colleague. Some operatives were assigned to investigate their own, not externally, but within the agency. You could be reassigned to monitor someone you once trained with, eat lunch with, maybe even trusted. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Everyone knew the game. Observe or be observed. Trust less. Report more. The culture wasn't just cautious, it was cannibalistic. The very system that demanded loyalty constantly tested it. Internal reviews were terrifying, not because you had something to hide, but because innocence didn't protect you. You could be pulled in for questioning about an old report, a missed phrase in a debrief, or a delay in communication. Most times it led nowhere, but sometimes it led to suspension, reassignment, or nothing at all, just a cold stare from someone higher up, and a sudden shift in how people treated you. Careers vanished quietly. One day your contact picked up your call, the next they didn't. No goodbye, no explanation. Their name disappeared from the roster. You were told they transferred. You knew better. Maybe they burned out. Maybe they broke protocol. Maybe someone planted something in their file. Maybe it was you. Promotions didn't always go to the best agents. Sometimes they went to the safest ones, the ones who never asked questions, never stood out, never challenged orders. Competence was valued, but obedience was required. You could have a spotless record and still be sidelined because someone higher up didn't like how confident you seemed. Suspicion wasn't just about actions, it was about tone, posture, eye contact. A wrong word in the wrong tone could shadow you for years. And so, you learned to stay small, speak carefully, smile when appropriate, disagree without sounding like you disagreed. You submitted reports in the exact expected format, double-checked every comma. You didn't linger in doorways. You didn't lock your desk drawers too tightly. That raised questions. But you also didn't leave them wide open, because that raised different questions. It was an endless performance. Even field agents had to report on each other. Debriefs weren't just about missions, they were about teammates. You were expected to note changes in behavior. If someone became distant, if someone started drinking more, if they expressed doubt about the mission, and if you failed to report those things and something went wrong later, you were responsible too. In some countries, purges happened without warning. Entire departments cleared out. People labelled as compromised, not by evidence, but by association. You didn't need to be guilty. You just needed to be near someone who was. The fear wasn't irrational. It was institutional. And yet you stayed. Because leaving was harder. Because leaving meant being alone with everything you'd done, every secret you'd carried, and no way to explain any of it. Because at least inside, you knew the rules, even if the rules could turn on you at any moment. You weren't afraid of being caught by the enemy. That was clean. That had protocol. What really kept you up at night was the thought that your own people might decide you were no longer useful, or worse, no longer trustworthy. And if that day came, there wouldn't be a confrontation. Just a call you didn't receive. A meeting that never happened. And a nameplate removed quietly from a door. Mistakes didn't come with warnings. There were no alarms, no dramatic music, no slow-motion consequences. One moment you were doing your job, and the next, everything started to feel off. A meeting didn't happen. A coded phrase wasn't returned. A face you'd never seen before was suddenly standing too close. That's how it began. Quiet, subtle, and irreversible. The worst part was that you didn't always know if something had gone wrong. Maybe the drop was missed. Maybe your contact got cold feet. Maybe someone intercepted the message and decided to play along. You didn't get clarity. You got silence. And in this line of work, silence could mean safety, or the beginning of the end. When a mission failed, the agency didn't send help. They sent distance. You became toxic, a liability. They pulled your resources, cut your communication lines, and told others not to talk to you. You stopped receiving updates. Your requests were ignored. You were still technically in the field, but it was like shouting into a void. Eventually, you realized no one was going to pick up the phone, no matter how many times you called. If your cover was blown, there wasn't a rescue plan. Embassies denied knowing you. Fellow agents were ordered not to assist. The safest outcome was arrest. The worst was disappearance. Some were taken and tortured for weeks. Others vanished without trace. Your name didn't make headlines. Your story wasn't told. You didn't become a cautionary tale. You were deleted. Extraction, when it happened, wasn't smooth. It required multiple layers of clearance and a reason good enough to risk other assets. That meant if you weren't essential, you stayed where you were. Some agents lived in hostile territory for months, even years after failing. They took on new identities, started fake lives, and waited. Waited for a call that might never come, holding on to a code phrase in their head that no one would ever ask for again. Failure wasn't just about the mission, it was about behavior. If you showed fear, doubt, or hesitation in the wrong moment, someone might decide you were compromised. And once that word appeared in a report, your career was effectively over. You might be reassigned to paperwork, put under internal surveillance, or quietly retired. Retired didn't always mean what people thought. Sometimes it meant leaving the agency. Sometimes it meant disappearing from every list permanently. The psychological damage of failure was rarely addressed. No one asked what went wrong from your perspective. No one cared about context. Debriefs were cold, factual, and often combative. If you defended yourself too strongly, it looked like guilt. If you didn't push back at all, it looked like confirmation. Either way, you lost. And when you returned to work, if you returned, you were treated differently. Less eye contact, fewer updates, more oversight. Some agents snapped. They went rogue, disappeared voluntarily, or turned themselves in just to escape the tension. Others spiraled quietly, drinking more, sleeping less, obsessing over every decision they made. Paranoia intensified. You began to believe your colleagues were setting you up. You questioned your handler's motives. You triple-checked every instruction, every detail, looking for a trap. And sometimes you were right. A single error could unravel years of carefully maintained cover. It could compromise networks, expose informants, and destroy alliances. The cost wasn't measured in missions lost. It was measured in people. A wrong address, a late signal, a misread phrase, and someone on the other side of the world paid the price. You learned to carry that, not because anyone helped you process it, but because there was no alternative. You didn't get second chances. You got reassigned, forgotten, or removed. You didn't explain your failure. You lived with it. If you were lucky, you learned from it. If you weren't, you didn't live long enough for that to matter. In the end, failing didn't just mean the mission failed. It meant the illusion failed. The delicate balance of trust, fear, control, and purpose that kept you in motion. And once that was gone, there wasn't much left. Just a name in a file, a few burnt contacts, and the knowledge that you'd been useful once, until you weren't. Years in the field don't make you tougher. They wear you down, slowly and without ceremony. You don't build resilience, you burn it. The more time you spend living under aliases and watching your back, the more the cracks start to show. Not all at once, not dramatically, just small invisible fractures that spread until one day you realize you're not the same person you were when you started, and you're not sure you like what's left. Physically, the toll is obvious. Bad sleep, bad posture, constant stress. Your back hurts because cheap mattresses don't care if you're on assignment. Your knees ache because surveillance requires hours of standing in one spot, pretending you're not watching. Your stomach's a mess because you eat whatever's available. Cold soup, street food, rations with expiration dates you've learned to ignore. You stop seeing doctors unless it's an emergency. Medical records draw attention. So does regular care. So you deal with pain the old-fashioned way. You ignore it. Your diet, your habits, your sleep, all get sacrificed for the mission. No exercise routines, no stretches, no days off. You work when the mission needs you. You eat when it's safe. You rest when there's no other option. Over time, your body adjusts by breaking down quietly. Migraines become normal. Eye strain never leaves. A toothache you've ignored for 3 years starts keeping you awake. You don't complain. There's no one to complain to. The mental fatigue is worse. There's no endpoint, no medal, no parade, no satisfying conclusion. Just another mission, another city, another fake life. You begin to lose track of where you've been. Street names blur, faces blur, memories blur. You meet people and forget their names instantly, not because you're rude, but because your brain is always prioritizing survival, not connection. You forget how to talk to people who aren't part of the game. You're always scanning for subtext, always ready to pivot the conversation if it gets too personal. You give fake anecdotes, fake hobbies, fake preferences. After a while, it becomes hard to remember what you actually enjoy. Music, books, food, they all feel distant. You used to have favorites. Now you just pick what's easiest to fake. Relationships are nearly impossible. You might try here and there. You meet someone who doesn't ask too many questions, who seems okay with your odd schedule and vague job description. But then they notice things. How you never leave anything on your desk. How you never sleep deeply. How you always check the back exit when entering a restaurant. And eventually, they ask the one question you can't answer. Who are you really? You don't have a good answer. Not anymore. Even if you leave the field, the habits follow you. You sit in corners. You memorize license plates. You keep a go bag under the bed, even if you live alone and don't travel anymore. You flinch at sudden noises. You stay quiet during arguments, not out of discipline, but because you've spent too long not reacting. Retirement isn't relief, it's confusion. The agency stops calling. Your name is cleared from rosters. Your past becomes sealed behind redacted files and silent nods. No one celebrates your years of service. You just stop existing in that world. And in the real world, you don't quite fit. You try to build a normal life, but normal doesn't feel safe. People get close, and it makes you anxious. They ask questions, and you freeze. You go to job interviews and realize your resume is a lie. You think about therapy, but how do you explain your trauma when the words themselves are classified? Many former agents drift. Some drink, some move to quiet towns where no one asks questions. Some live alone, collecting routines like souvenirs, trying to simulate normalcy. A few try to write it down, not to publish, just to remember. Just to prove they were there, that it happened. But most don't. They stay silent. They pretend the years never happened. They avoid news reports that remind them of old missions. They ignore the names of former contacts that occasionally resurface, usually in obituaries. They know better than to reach out. The silence is safer. Over time, they start forgetting even the fake names they used. The lies they told blend together. The only thing that remains sharp is the tension, the muscle memory of fear, the instinct to look over their shoulder, to listen for the phone that never rings, to wait for a knock that no longer comes, but could. And that's the final cost. Not death, not exposure, just the slow erosion of self. A life spent erasing footprints until one day there's nothing left of you at all. When the Cold War ended, there were no parades for the people who spent their lives in silence. Politicians shook hands, walls came down, headlines shouted about victory and reunification. But for the agents in the field, the people who had lived for decades behind fake identities and in constant fear, there was no ceremony, no final mission, just a quiet message, if they were lucky, saying the game was over. Some never even got that. For years, these people lived with purpose, however miserable it was. They woke up with objectives. They moved through cities with plans. They memorized, recorded, reported. And then suddenly, there was no mission left. No more coded drops. No more whispers in back alleys. The structures that had defined their lives evaporated in a matter of months. And for many of them, that was the real crisis. Espionage wasn't just a job. It was a system of meaning. It told you who you were, what you had to do, what you had to sacrifice. When that ended, it didn't feel like peace. It felt like being discarded, like you'd been useful until the very moment you weren't. Governments didn't need spies anymore, so they stopped answering calls. Budgets were slashed, contacts disappeared, intelligence branches folded. The world moved on. You didn't. Former agents weren't reintegrated. There was no transition plan, no retraining, no mental health support. You were just off the books. Your entire career was a sealed file. Your skills, interrogation, infiltration, surveillance, were suddenly useless. Worse than useless, because you couldn't talk about them, use them, or admit you had them. Some tried to adapt. They joined security firms or consulting groups. But civilian life didn't fit. Offices felt too exposed. Clients asked too many questions, and the work never came close to the intensity they were used to. They went from managing human assets and evading foreign agents to filling out spreadsheets and attending HR meetings. The dissonance broke some of them completely. Others tried to disappear. They moved to remote towns, changed their names one last time, and lived quietly, hoping the world would leave them alone, and succeeded. Others didn't. Some were found by enemies who still held grudges, by governments who never really trusted them, or by ghosts of past operations that never truly ended. The irony is that even after peace was declared, the machinery of surveillance didn't stop. Intelligence agencies shifted focus, updated tools, and rebranded. The Cold War ended, but espionage adapted. Satellites replaced informants. Cyber attacks replaced briefcases. But the core remained. People watching other people, lying for a living, pretending to belong somewhere they didn't. Except now, the original spies, the Cold War veterans, were too outdated to be useful and too informed to be comfortable. Some became whistleblowers. Others wrote memoirs, heavily edited and approved. A few tried to warn about the cost of secrecy, but most were ignored. Their experience was too inconvenient, too shadowed in moral grey areas, too hard to sell to a public hungry for clean narratives. And so, they faded. Not dramatically, not tragically, just gradually, like smoke from a fire no one remembers starting. They were never supposed to be known in the first place. Their job was to erase themselves, and in the end, they did it too well. History rarely mentions them. Textbooks talk about missiles, leaders, treaties. They don't mention the man who slept on a different couch every night for 5 years, or the woman who delivered a code through a folded map while pretending to order lunch, or the thousands of others who lived between the lines of history, doing jobs no one could ever confirm. For them, the Cold War never really ended. It just stopped being reported. The tension, the habits, the silence, they lingered. Some still flinch at the sound of a certain accent. Some still scan crowds for familiar faces. Some still avoid making friends. Not because they're in danger, but because they forgot how not to be. The world declared peace. They declared nothing. They just kept existing in the same quiet way they always had. Watching, waiting, knowing that the war may be over, but the cost was permanent. By the time you step away from that life, if you ever truly do, it's hard to explain what you've become. You're not the same person who joined. You're not the hero of any story. You're not a villain either. You're just someone who did what was asked, for reasons that seemed clear at the time. Someone who spent too many years in rooms where no one used their real name and now doesn't remember how to say their own without hesitation. You carry things no one else sees, not physical scars, though some have those too. It's the mental load, the reflexes you can't turn off, the way you scan rooms, measure exits, track patterns in people's speech. You do it without meaning to. You do it even when it doesn't matter anymore. And sometimes you wish you could stop. People around you get older, slower, softer. They build lives, memories, albums full of real vacations and bad family photos. You have fragments, faces with no names, cities that blur together, laughter you fake during a cover dinner, regret that sneaks in when it's quiet. You see their lives and realize how much of your own was given away, piece by piece, to jobs no one can ever thank you for. You're not bitter. Not exactly. You chose the work, or maybe it chose you. Either way, you went willingly. What you didn't realize was how much you'd have to lose to keep going, and how little would be left when it stopped. There's no ceremony at the end, no farewell party, just a desk that gets reassigned, a file that gets archived, and a silence that follows you home. Sometimes you dream about it, not the action, the waiting, the silence in stairwells, the buzz of cheap radios, the way a stranger's glance could ruin everything. You don't miss it, but it's imprinted. Your brain holds on to those things the way a body remembers trauma. You wake up and check the window without thinking. You memorize street names out of habit. You flinch at certain languages. You carry it all, even now. You try to explain it to people, carefully, without saying too much. You say you used to travel a lot, that you worked in international relations, that you handled logistics. It's not a lie. But it's not the truth either. The truth is messier, harder to digest, and mostly irrelevant now. The people who needed to know already knew. The ones who didn't never will. There's a strange comfort in routine. Even now, you keep a schedule. You maintain the appearance of normal life. You shop at the same grocery store. You nod at the same clerk. You sit at the same cafe table. You do this not because you enjoy it, but because it gives structure to something that still feels unstable. Normalcy becomes your last cover. If you're lucky, someone knows the real story. A partner, maybe. A friend who figured it out. Someone who doesn't ask too many questions but understands when you pause too long before answering. If you're not lucky, you carry it alone. And after a while, that feels normal too. The world moves on. New wars. New intelligence. New names doing the same things you once did. You watch it from a distance now, not with pride or envy, just recognition. You see the signs others miss. You know the cadence of denial. You hear the rehearsed statements and know what they're covering for. It's like watching a younger version of yourself, still chasing something that can't be held. And in the quiet moments, late at night, early in the morning, you wonder what it would have been like if you'd chosen something else, something simpler, something honest. But then you remember the truth. There wasn't really a choice. Not for you. The path was there, and you took it, and now you walk its echo, one quiet step at a time. Not because someone's still watching, not because the mission continues, but because this is who you became. And now, even in peace, you move like you're still at war. Not afraid, not regretful, just prepared. Just in case.